The sun was still low over the dry plains when a cowboy named Ben rode his old horse into the small town market. The wooden stalls were lined with dusty goods. There were sacks of grain, old tools, worn hats and a few tired animals tied near the fence. Ben had not come to buy anything special. He only wanted to sell some eggs and check the price of feed. Near the far end of the market he heard loud barking. It was sharp and angry. People were staying away from one small corner. Ben turned his head and saw a man holding a rope. At the end of the rope was a small brown puppy with bright eyes and a rough coat. The puppy pulled hard and snapped at anyone who came close. Its teeth showed and its tail was stiff. A few children stood at a distance and watched. One boy tried to walk closer, but the puppy lunged and barked. The boy jumped back in fear and his mother pulled him away. The man holding the rope looked tired and annoyed. Someone asked him why the puppy was so mean. The man shook his head and said the pup was no good. He said it tried to bite his chickens and even his boots. He said he wanted to get rid of it today. He did not care about money anymore. Ben stopped and watched the scene. He saw more than an angry puppy. He saw fear in its eyes. Its ears were pressed back and it shook with tension. Its ribs showed under the fur. It looked like it had not eaten well. The man shouted at the crowd and raised his voice. He said anyone could take the puppy for 25 cents. He waved a dirty coin in the air and laughed. No one stepped forward. Ben thought of his quiet ranch. He thought of the lonely evenings with only the sound of the wind and the creaking barn. He did not really need a dog. A wild and angry puppy would be trouble. Still his feet moved closer. He stopped a few steps away, careful not to stare too hard at the puppy. He had learned long ago that scared animals did not like sharp eyes. The puppy barked at him, but its voice wavered. Up close Ben saw that its paws were scraped and its fur was full of dust. Its nose twitched as it smelled the leather of his boots. Ben spoke in a calm, low voice. He said he was not going to hurt the pup. His words were simple and slow. The puppy did not understand the language, but it seemed to sense the tone. The barking grew softer. It still showed its teeth, but it no longer jumped at the rope. The man holding the rope rolled his eyes. He told Ben the dog was trouble. He said the pup would never listen and would only cause pain. Ben looked from the man to the puppy. For a moment he thought of turning away. He imagined the pup being tied somewhere else or worse. His chest felt tight. He reached into his pocket and felt a few coins. 25 cents was not much, but money was money on the ranch. Feed was not cheap. Yet something inside him would not let him walk past. He took out the coins and held them up. He said he would take the puppy. The man blinked, surprised, then quickly nodded and handed over the rope. The coins disappeared into his hand. He turned away without even saying goodbye to the dog. The puppy froze as the rope changed hands. Ben knelt down slowly so he would not tower over it. He kept his body relaxed and his voice soft. He told the puppy that its life had changed now. He said they were going home. The puppy gave a small growl, but it sounded more confused than angry. Ben held out his hand with fingers curled. The puppy sniffed the air around his hand. Then it made a sudden move and nipped at him. Its teeth scraped his skin, but he did not pull back in shock. He had dealt with young colts and nervous cattle. He knew that quick fear could break trust. Instead he stayed still and let the puppy see that he was not going to strike. The puppy seemed surprised. Its ears rose a little. It stopped growling. A woman watching from a distance shook her head. She told Ben he was making a mistake. She said that some animals were born bad. Ben did not answer. He just stood and gently tugged the rope. The puppy resisted at first, paws sliding on the dust. Then, step by small step, it followed him toward the horse. Ben lifted the pup into a small sack with the top open so it could see out, and tied the sack to the side of the saddle. The puppy snarled and wriggled, but once the horse began to move, the rhythm of the ride slowly calmed it. The town slipped behind them, and the open land spread wide under the bright sky. On the way home a strange feeling grew in Ben. It was a mix of doubt and hope. He had bought a problem for 25 cents. Yet he also felt that he had taken hold of something unfinished. Something that might become strong and good if given time. When the ranch came into view, with its small house, worn fence and wide pasture, the puppy lifted its head. It sniffed the new air. There was the smell of horses, hay, dust and far-off water. Ben untied the sack and set the puppy on the ground. It stood there, tense and uncertain. The ranch dog from the neighbor barked in the distance. A few cows lifted their heads and watched. Ben crouched and looked at the puppy. He said the name came to his mind without planning. He called the puppy Rust, because of the reddish shade in its fur, and because it seemed like something old and neglected that might shine again with care. The puppy tilted its head at the sound of the new name. It did not wag its tail. It did not run to him. But it did not snap this time either. The wind picked up and carried dust across the yard. Somewhere a gate creaked. Ben straightened his back and led Rust toward the small shed he planned to use as a kennel. He only hoped that the decision he had made for 25 cents would not turn his quiet ranch into a storm. He did not know that in 3 months the same puppy would leave him standing in pure shock, with his whole life shifted in a way he could not yet imagine. The first week on the ranch was hard for both Ben and Rust. The puppy did not trust anyone. It barked at the chickens, at the wind, even at its own shadow. Whenever Ben opened the small gate to bring food, Rust would rush forward and snap near his boots. Ben never raised his hand against the dog. He used a flat board to slide the bowl of food into the kennel. He spoke in a calm voice each time, calling the pup by name and telling it what he was doing. Every night the barking echoed across the quiet land. The horses shifted in their stalls. The cows huddled together. The chickens fluttered on their roost. One afternoon a neighbor named Tom rode over to check on Ben. Tom was older, with a careful way of speaking and a thin gray beard. He heard the barking before he reached the yard. When he saw Rust, his eyebrows rose. He asked Ben why he had brought such an angry dog onto the ranch. Ben explained about the market and the 25 cents. Tom shook his head and said some dogs were trouble from the start. He warned that Rust could scare off buyers, spook cattle or worse. Ben listened but did not argue. He just said he wanted to try. He believed that no creature was born only for anger. Tom watched as Ben went to the kennel. Rust rushed forward, teeth bared, but Ben did not step back. He placed the bowl and then sat down a little distance away, outside the fence. He stayed there without speaking for a long time, letting the dog get used to his presence. Rust ate with quick bites, growling between mouthfuls. After a while the growling turned to heavy breathing. The sun dropped lower and painted the sky in orange and red. Tom saw that Ben was not going to give up easily. He told him to be careful and then rode home, the sound of his horse fading into the evening. Days turned into weeks. Rust kept his wild heart, but something began to change. The barking at night grew shorter. The snaps at Ben's boots became less sharp and more like uncertain warnings. Ben started to leave the kennel gate open while he sat nearby with a piece of rope in hand. Rust would poke his head out, look around, then retreat inside again. One day the pup made it all the way to the edge of the gate. Its nose quivered as it smelled the open yard. A gust of wind rattled a loose tin sheet on the barn. Rust jumped and rushed back into the kennel. Ben did not laugh or mock the fear. He only stayed where he was, silent and steady. Slowly Rust learned that the ranch was not the noisy market. No one kicked at him. No one yanked the rope to prove a point. The only hands that came close were gentle and patient. One morning, as Ben poured water into a shallow pan, Rust brushed his hand with a wet nose. It was quick and almost by accident, but the touch was real. Ben felt a small spark of hope. He began to take short walks with Rust on a long rope around the yard. At first Rust pulled in every direction. He lunged at fluttering birds, at moving grass and at the distant shapes of cattle. Ben kept the rope firm but did not jerk it. He just held steady and used simple words like stop and come. The puppy tested every limit. It tried to twist free. It tried to run back to the kennel. It tried to chase anything that moved. By the end of each walk, Rust would be panting, sides heaving, eyes wide. At night, Ben would sit on his porch with a cup of coffee. He watched the stars appear one by one. Rust lay some distance away, still on a line, but no longer straining at it. The wide sky and open land seemed to press down, holding both man and dog under the same quiet spell. Then the first real test came. One evening a coyote slipped near the chicken coop. The light was low and shadows stretched long. The coyote crept along the fence, eyes bright and hungry. Rust saw it before anyone else. His body went stiff and a low growl rose from his throat. Ben, who was closing the barn door, turned just in time to see Rust jerk against his rope and break free. The rope snapped where it had worn thin against a post. Rust shot across the yard like an arrow. His bark was no longer just anger. It was a sharp warning. The coyote froze for a second, then turned and ran, startled by the sudden rush of sound and fur. Rust chased it almost to the far fence before Ben called out. His voice was strong and firm as he used the command he had repeated every day. He shouted the word come. To his surprise, Rust slowed. The pup glanced back, torn between the running enemy and the familiar voice. After a long moment, Rust turned and trotted back, tail high and chest puffed out. He barked once more at the empty fields as if claiming victory. Ben knelt and grabbed the torn rope. Rust panted in front of him, eyes bright. For the first time the pup allowed Ben to rest a hand on his head. The touch was brief, but Rust did not pull away. The chickens clucked nervously in the coop. The smell of dust and fear still hung in the air. Yet as Ben looked down at Rust, he felt a new respect growing. The dog was still aggressive. It was still wild. But now that wildness had shown a purpose. It had driven away danger instead of turning inward. From that night on, Ben began to wonder if there was more to Rust than a bad temper. He did not know where the pup had come from or what kind of life it had known before the market. He only knew that inside that rough frame there was a sharp mind and a fierce heart that was beginning to choose the right side. He had bought an angry puppy for 25 cents. On evenings like that, watching Rust sit alert by the chicken coop, he felt that the real price might be much higher, but so might the reward. The bond between Ben and Rust grew, but it was not smooth. Some days Rust was calm, following commands and walking at Ben's side with his head held high. Other days he seemed full of old fear. A sudden loud sound could make him spin around and snap at the air. At times he would rush to a corner of the yard and bark at nothing, as if chasing shadows only he could see. One afternoon Tom returned, bringing a sack of feed. As they unloaded it near the barn, Rust watched from a distance. The pup stood stiff, eyes locked on the stranger. Tom asked how the dog was doing. Ben said Rust was better but still had his wild days. He mentioned the coyote and how Rust had chased it off. Tom raised an eyebrow and gave the dog a longer look. He said that kind of bravery did not come from nowhere. He asked if Ben knew anything about where Rust had come from. Ben shook his head. All he knew was the market and the seller who wanted to be rid of the pup. Tom frowned and said he knew the man who sold the dog. His name was Lee, and he had lived near a group of old sheds by the dry creek. Rumors had moved around the town for months about strange sounds and rough handling of animals there. Ben felt a hard knot grow in his chest. He did not like the thought of anyone hurting animals. He asked Tom to show him the place. They tied Rust with a strong rope and left him in the shade with fresh water. The pup whined softly as Ben walked away, but he did not pull as hard as he once would have. Tom and Ben rode out toward the dry creek. The land grew rough and cracked. Old fence posts leaned at odd angles. Soon they reached a cluster of broken-down sheds, half swallowed by weeds and thorn bushes. The air smelled of dust and something else, something stale and bitter. Ben dismounted and walked slowly among the sheds. The doors hung loose. Inside he saw old crates, rusty chains, and worn wooden posts. He did not see any animals, but there were marks on the ground, scratched deep as if many paws had torn at the dirt over and over. There were chew marks on the posts where animals had reached out with teeth. Ben felt his jaw tighten. Without saying much, he walked to the far shed. There he found a broken collar half buried in the dust. The leather was torn. A small mark on the metal ring looked like the same mark on the rope Rust had worn that first day. Tom watched silently. He did not talk about the rumors in detail. He did not need to. Ben understood enough. The pups here had likely been kept in harsh ways, maybe forced to fight or bark until they lost their voices. He picked up the collar and held it in his hand. His fingers closed around the old leather. He could almost see a small younger Rust trapped in this place, forced to be loud and hard just to survive. No wonder the dog woke in the night with tense muscles and fierce barks. No wonder he trusted so slowly and flinched at sudden moves. On the ride home Ben was quiet. At the ranch Rust rushed to the edge of his line when he saw him. The pup jumped and gave a rough bark that sounded almost happy. Ben knelt and showed Rust the broken collar. Rust sniffed it and pulled back with a low whine. His tail dropped and he stepped behind Ben as if he wanted the thing taken away. Ben understood. He walked to the old fire pit and placed the collar there. With a match he lit some dry twigs under it. The flames rose and slowly licked around the worn leather. Rust watched, eyes wide, ears forward. Ben spoke in a gentle voice. He said the old life was gone now. He said that whatever had happened before, it would not follow Rust here. The fire burned bright then died down, leaving only black ash and a faint smell in the air. Rust moved closer and sniffed the cooling pit. Then he walked back to Ben and leaned lightly against his leg. It was the first time he had chosen such contact on his own. That night Rust slept more quietly. The usual sharp barks came only once or twice and faded quickly. In the morning he seemed different. He still moved with energy, still chased birds and paced the fence line, but some of the tightness in his body was gone. Over the next weeks Ben noticed something else. Rust had a strange sense about people. When strangers passed near the ranch road, the dog would watch them. With some he only gave a short, alert bark, then relaxed. With others he stiffened, teeth showing, as if he sensed something off in the way they moved or looked across the land. Once a pair of men stopped by, claiming they were looking for work. They kept asking about Ben's tools and where he stored them. Rust would not stop growling at them. His eyes stayed locked on their hands. The men left soon, muttering under their breath. Later Tom heard that the same pair had been caught trying to steal from a store in town. Ben began to trust Rust's instincts. When the dog stiffened and gave that deep warning growl, Ben paid attention. The more he worked with Rust, the more he saw that the aggressive energy inside the dog was not simple rage. It was heightened alertness, a sharp edge that could be turned toward danger instead of toward friends. Still, he could not shake one question. Why had he found this dog for just 25 cents on that one day? It felt almost like the land itself had pushed Rust into his path. 3 months were nearly up since that market morning. The days were growing hotter. Dark clouds began to gather more often over the far hills, hinting at summer storms. Ben did not know it yet, but one of those storms was about to crash into his life. When it did, Rust would show him something that made the old price at the market seem almost like a hidden joke of fate. The heat came first. It sat heavy over the ranch for days, pressing down on man and animal. The air was so dry that even the grass seemed to sigh when the wind moved through it. Ben worked slower, taking more breaks in the shade. Rust stayed close to the house, tongue hanging out, searching for any cool patch of dirt. Then the sky began to change. One afternoon a line of dark clouds rose over the distant hills. They looked thick and strong, stacking on top of each other until they formed a long wall. The air grew strangely still, as if the land was holding its breath. Rust felt it before Ben did. The dog paced along the yard fence, nose up, ears alert. He gave short, uneasy barks at the empty sky. Ben glanced up and nodded to himself. He had seen storms like this before, but it had been some years since one had rolled in with such force. He began to move quickly, checking the barn doors, tying down loose boards and making sure the animals were secure. The wind picked up. It came in sudden bursts, slamming into the house and rattling the windows. Dust whirled across the yard in sharp spirals. The chickens squawked and hurried into their coop. The cows bellowed low, crowding in the far corner of the field. Rust's pacing grew faster. He tugged at his rope and whined. When Ben walked past, the dog barked at him in a sharp, urgent way, as if trying to speak. Ben patted his head and told him to stay calm. He still had one more job. The small irrigation ditch near the lower field was close to overflowing from the last light rain. If this new storm dropped heavy water, the ditch could flood and eat away at the fence posts. He grabbed his hat and headed toward the lower field with a shovel. He planned to clear a few channels so any extra water could escape away from the posts. Rust did not like this at all. The dog barked and tried to follow, the rope cutting into the ground as he lunged. Ben turned once and called back that he would return soon. Lightning flickered in the clouds. Thunder rolled like distant wagons over stone. Still the main wind had not yet hit. It was that strange heavy moment before the storm truly broke. At the lower field, the ditch was already running with a thin line of muddy water. Ben moved quickly, digging small side cuts to guide any future overflow. Sweat ran down his face even as the first cool drops of rain began to fall. Then, without warning, the sky opened. Rain slammed down in thick sheets. In seconds Ben was soaked. The ground turned slippery. The ditch swelled, the small trickle turning into a rushing stream. Ben realized he had stayed too long. He threw the shovel over his shoulder and started back toward the house. The wind howled and pushed against him, making each step harder. On the far side of the field lay a narrow gully. Most days it was dry and harmless. During storms it could turn into a fast channel of water. By the time Ben reached it, the low path was already filling. Brown water rushed through, carrying sticks and bits of grass. He paused, judging the best place to cross. It did not look too deep yet. He stepped down and felt the current grab at his boots. He pushed forward, leaning into the flow. Halfway across his foot slipped on a hidden stone. The strong water twisted around his legs. He lost his balance and fell hard onto one knee. The shovel flew from his hand. For a moment his head dipped close to the water as the current tried to drag him down the gully. He grabbed for a rock but his fingers slid on the wet surface. Panic flared in his chest. The water roared in his ears. It pulled at him with surprising force, like many hands grabbing his clothes. Back at the ranch Rust fought his rope like never before. The dog could not see what was happening to Ben, but something in the direction of the lower field filled him with a deep, urgent fear. He yanked until his neck strained. The rope dug into the ground and then, with a sharp snap, it broke loose. Rust bolted across the yard through wind and rain. He followed the faint scent of Ben and the sound of distant water. His paws slid in the mud, but he kept running. Ben was now lying on his side in the gully, one leg caught between two rocks. The water crashed around him, rising higher every second. He tried to free his leg, but the force of the flow pressed him down. A piece of drifting would hit his shoulder, spinning away down the gully. For a moment he had a cold, clear thought that this might be his last foolish mistake. Alone in the storm, stuck in a narrow cut of earth with no one to see. Then a sharp bark cut through the roar of the rain. Rust appeared on the bank above him, soaked and wild-eyed. The dog barked again and ran along the edge, looking for a way down. Loose dirt slid under his paws. He jumped down to a small ledge and from there leaped closer to where Ben lay trapped. Ben tried to speak, but water splashed into his mouth. He coughed hard. Rust came even closer, ignoring the rising stream. The dog planted his paws on the wet stone near Ben's chest and leaned in, teeth grabbing at Ben's coat near the shoulder. With a fierce growl, Rust began to pull. It was not a gentle tug. It was a full strong hauling of his weight backward. His paws slipped but he dug in again, claws scraping against the rock. The fabric of Ben's coat grew tight across his body. The pull changed the angle of Ben's body just enough. His trapped leg shifted a little between the rocks. With the next strong yank it came loose. Pain shot up through his knee, but the freedom was real. Ben used his hands to push against the rock while Rust kept pulling. Together they dragged his body up the side of the gully, inch by inch, until they reached the edge and rolled onto the muddy grass above. For several seconds Ben could only lie there, chest heaving, rain pounding on his face. Rust stood over him, barking at the storm, tail stiff and eyes blazing. Mud smeared his fur. He looked like a wild creature born from the storm itself. When Ben finally sat up, Rust turned and pressed his head against Ben's chest. The dog gave a soft whine, so different from his usual sharp bark. Ben wrapped his arms around Rust's neck and held on. He felt the strong heartbeat under the wet fur. 3 months ago this same dog had tried to bite his hand for touching a food bowl. Now Rust had broken free, tracked him through a storm and pulled him out of a rushing gully. The shock of it hit Ben harder than the cold rain. He had trusted Rust, but he had not known the depth of the dog's loyalty until that moment. An animal that had every reason to hate humans had chosen to risk his own life for him. They struggled back to the house together, with Rust staying close to Ben's side and glancing up often as if checking that he was still there. By the time they reached the yard, Tom had arrived, having seen the storm from his place, and ridden over to help. He helped Ben inside, listened to the story, then looked at Rust with new eyes. He said that some men lived their whole lives without anyone ever pulling them out of a flood like that. He told Ben quietly that the 25-cent dog was worth more than some folks he had met in his time. Ben dried off and wrapped a blanket around his sore leg. Rust lay at his feet, soaked but proud, his head resting on his paws. The storm raged outside, but inside the small house something steady and strong had settled between man and dog. The cowboy who had bought an aggressive puppy for a handful of coins now sat staring at the animal that had just saved his life. He knew he would never look at Rust the same way again. The storm passed by morning, leaving the land washed clean and smelling of wet earth. Puddles shone in the yard. Broken twigs and bits of debris lay scattered along the fence. The gully that had nearly taken Ben's life was now a quieter channel of muddy water. Ben woke with a sore leg and stiff muscles, but he could stand and walk slowly. Rust stayed close to him, watching every step with serious eyes. Tom had stayed the night on the ranch to make sure Ben was all right. Over a breakfast of eggs and coffee they talked about the storm and about Rust. Tom said the dog had a rare heart. He told Ben that whatever bad place Rust had come from, the dog had chosen a different path now. He suggested that Ben let Rust move more freely around the ranch, not tied so often, as long as he kept training steady. Ben agreed. The broken rope from the night before still lay near the porch, a reminder that sometimes freedom was exactly what was needed. Over the next days Rust moved around the ranch, as if he had finally claimed it as his own. He patrolled the fence line, checked the chicken coop and watched the road with bright eyes. When Ben called his name, he came quickly, tail moving in a short firm wave. Word of the storm and the rescue spread quietly through the small town. People who had once shaken their heads at the wild puppy now looked at Rust with new respect. A few came by the ranch just to see the dog that had pulled a full-grown cowboy out of a flood. One afternoon the man from the market, Lee, rode past. He stopped at the fence and stared at Rust, who stood a safe distance away, body tense but silent. Lee called out and asked if that was the same crazy pup he had sold for 25 cents. Ben nodded. Lee gave a short laugh and said he had thought that dog would never be good for anything. He said he had almost thrown the pup out or taken it somewhere he would rather not name. He said Ben must have magic to make such an angry creature useful. Ben stared at him with a quiet, steady gaze. He replied that it was not magic. It was time, patience and a choice not to give up on a heart that had only known fear. Lee looked away, uncomfortable. Rust let out a single low growl. The man quickly tipped his hat and rode on. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Ben walked to the gully again. Rust followed at his side. The edges of the channel showed marks where his body had once been dragged. The memory of the rushing water rose clear in his mind. He sat on a stone and Rust settled beside him. Ben reached into his pocket and took out a small coin. It was one of the same kind he had used at the market. He turned it in his fingers, watching the light glint on the worn surface. He thought about all the small choices that had brought him here. A coin exchanged for a rope. A decision to stay patient. A trip to old sheds by a dry creek. A storm that almost ended his story. And a dog who had refused to let that story end. He placed the coin on the rock between them. He told Rust that some people measured worth in money. They looked at a small scared puppy and saw a cheap problem to be thrown away. But he said that to him, Rust was now beyond price. Rust did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. The dog rested his head on Ben's knee and let out a long slow breath. As the days turned into weeks, Rust's name became known beyond the ranch. A family from town asked if Ben would help them train their own nervous dog, using the same gentle methods. Ben agreed, and Rust helped by showing how a once wild pup could now walk calmly by his side. Children who had once been told to stay away from the barking dog at the market now stood at the fence and watched Rust with bright, curious eyes. With Ben's permission and careful guidance, some of them even learned how to offer a hand for Rust to sniff, standing still and respectful. Rust remained sharp. He still barked at true danger. When a stray bull broke a fence one day and moved toward the house, Rust placed himself between the animal and the porch, barking fiercely until Ben arrived with a rope and stick to turn the bull away. The aggressive strength that had once scared the town was now a shield for the ranch. On quiet nights Ben would sit on the porch with a blanket over his knees and Rust at his feet. The stars spread across the sky in a bright river. The land lay wide and calm around them. Sometimes Ben thought of that first morning at the market. He remembered the rough rope, the angry barks and the way people had stepped back in fear. He remembered holding out the coins and feeling unsure. If someone had told him then what this dog would do for him, he would not have believed it. If someone had said that the wild pup would one day risk his life to drag him from a flood, scare off thieves and calm nervous children, he would have laughed and shaken his head. Yet here they were. A cowboy and a dog, bound not by price but by shared days, trials and trust. Ben picked up the small coin from the rock near the gully and slipped it back into his pocket. He decided he would keep it always as a reminder of the day he thought he was only buying a problem. He looked down at Rust and smiled. He said that some shocks were painful, like a fall into cold rushing water. But some shocks were a gift, like discovering that the most aggressive little puppy in the market had the biggest, bravest heart he had ever known. Rust lifted his head, eyes meeting Ben's. In that simple look lay everything the dog could not say with words. The wind moved softly across the field. The ranch creaked and settled into evening. Somewhere in the distance a coyote cried, but it did not dare come close. The cowboy who had bought an aggressive puppy for 25 cents sat at the edge of his land and watched the sky. Beside him lay the true treasure that had come from that choice.